John Harris, a dedicated federal prosecutor, steps into a quiet courthouse in Augusta, Georgia, ready to challenge a property tax hike on his late grandmother's home. But his day takes a shocking turn when he's fined $750 for being just a few minutes late, a punishment that feels harsh and unjust. As he looks around the courtroom, John notices something strange: others who arrived later are ignored. Why was he singled out? As the hearing continues, John realizes that the judge, Samuel Fitzgerald, is not only biased but has been treating black defendants unfairly for years. This injustice sparks a battle, not just for a tax adjustment, but for accountability in the entire legal system. Will John's fight for justice succeed, or will the system he's fought for his whole life turn its back on him? Stay tuned to discover how John takes on an entire system. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below. On a bright and warm morning in Augusta, Georgia, John Harris, an experienced federal prosecutor, parked his car outside the municipal courthouse. As he stepped out of the vehicle, he felt a familiar rush of tension. He prided himself on being punctual. Time management was critical in his line of work. However, today was different. John had been delayed due to an emergency related to an ongoing human trafficking case that required immediate attention. He had barely had time to grab a quick coffee, and now he found himself walking into the courthouse with minutes to spare. John's mission for the day seemed simple enough. He was there to challenge an unjust property tax increase on the house that had belonged to his late grandmother. The property was more than just a piece of real estate to him, it was a symbol of his family's history, a place filled with memories of his childhood. The city had inexplicably raised the property taxes, and John had spent weeks gathering evidence to prove that the tax increase was an error. As he entered the courthouse, the long hallway echoed with the sounds of people in various states of distress, families dealing with minor legal disputes, individuals facing fines, and others simply trying to navigate the often confusing legal system. Despite the mundane nature of his case, John couldn't shake the feeling of unease in the air. The municipal court was nothing like the federal courts he was used to, less formal and more hectic, with an almost palpable sense of impatience hanging in the air. John quickly checked his watch and noted he had only about 10 minutes before his case would be called. He found the courtroom, and upon entering, he noticed it was already filling up with people. He took a seat near the back, trying to gather his thoughts and review his evidence. Moments later, the judge walked in, a tall man with a stern expression, Judge Samuel Fitzgerald. He had a reputation for being no-nonsense, and as soon as he entered, the room fell silent. John had heard stories about the judge's strictness with latecomers, but he wasn't overly concerned. He had always prided himself on his professionalism and was confident that the facts of his case would speak for themselves. The session began, and John couldn't help but notice that a few others had arrived after the scheduled start time. Yet, none of them were met with the same scrutiny. When John's name was finally called, he stood up, walked to the podium, and began to present his case. However, Judge Fitzgerald did not waste time in addressing John's late arrival. "Mr. Harris," he said sharply, his voice cutting through the quiet room, "do you think your time is more valuable than the court's?" The word struck John like a blow, and he quickly responded, offering a brief explanation about his delay due to the federal case. The judge wasn't having it. "Excuses don't excuse tardiness," he retorted, dismissing John's attempt to justify himself. John felt the weight of the gavel, not just physically but emotionally. He had been treated as if his explanation didn't matter, as though his work wasn't as important as the rules of this municipal courtroom. Despite the judge's harsh tone, John remained calm. He was there to do a job, and he intended to do it. But as the session continued, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He observed that other latecomers, some who had arrived much later than he had, weren't reprimanded in the same manner. The disparity was clear, and as he sat down to await his turn, a sense of injustice began to take root in his mind. This wasn't just about a minor delay, it was about something larger, something systemic. John was no stranger to bias, having witnessed it in various forms throughout his career, but he could not ignore the pattern in front of him. This was only the beginning for John Harris. As the courtroom session unfolded, he made a quiet decision that would change everything. This wouldn't be a day of simply challenging a property tax increase, it would become a fight for fairness, equality, and justice in the court system. He knew he had to stand up, not just for himself, but for all those who had been subjected to unfair treatment in the name of the law. And as he left the courtroom that day, John felt a renewed sense of purpose. His work was far from over. As John sat in the back of the courtroom, his thoughts raced. He had been treated unfairly, there was no doubt about it. The fine imposed on him for a simple delay was not just about his lateness, it was a glaring example of something deeper. Looking around the room, John couldn't help but notice that others who had arrived later than him, including a young woman and a man in a gray suit, had not faced any consequences for their tardiness. They sat quietly, unbothered by the judge's wrath, while John, a respected federal prosecutor, had been humiliated for what seemed like an innocent mistake. His mind continued to churn as the court proceeded with other cases. He observed the room closely, noting the discomfort on the faces of some of the other individuals present. Many seemed to be acutely aware of the judge's biased treatment, but no one dared to speak up. They all kept their heads down, their gazes directed at their papers or phones, unwilling to challenge the authority of Judge Fitzgerald. The silence in the room was deafening, and John could feel the weight of it pressing on him. Despite the tension, John remained composed. He had faced much worse in his career, and he wasn't about to let this slide. He knew the stakes. This wasn't just about his personal humiliation. It was about a systemic issue that had long been ignored in this courtroom, a pattern of preferential treatment based on race and status. John had worked with enough cases of injustice to recognize when he was witnessing something bigger than just a bad morning. When the judge called his name again, John stood up without hesitation. His demeanor was calm, but there was a fire in his eyes. As he approached the podium, he could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him, some with admiration, others with uncertainty. This was no longer about a simple property tax dispute. It was about fairness. It was about the integrity of the legal system, a system that should serve all people equally, regardless of their background or race. Your Honor, John began, his voice steady but firm, I must insist on presenting my case regarding the property tax adjustment. This adjustment is not only erroneous but unfairly applied. I have gathered extensive documentation, and I believe it is important for the court to review the facts. Judge Fitzgerald looked at him with a disinterested gaze, but John could feel the shift in the room. This time, he wasn't backing down. The judge sighed, his fingers drumming lightly on the desk, as he gestured for John to proceed. But as John began outlining the discrepancies in the tax assessment, Judge Fitzgerald quickly interrupted him. I'll look at it later, the judge muttered dismissively, barely acknowledging the seriousness of John's argument. But your tardiness is a matter we cannot overlook. John took a deep breath, holding back the frustration that threatened to surface. He knew he had to be strategic. Your Honor, I understand the importance of respecting the rules of this court, he said. But I must ask, are these rules applied equally to everyone? The judge's expression hardened, and the room seemed to hold its breath. John's question hung in the air, a challenge to the fairness of the system. The silence was broken only by the sharp sound of the gavel. Do you imply that this court operates in an unjust manner, Mr. Harris? Judge Fitzgerald's voice was low but laced with irritation. I am simply asking for clarity, John replied, his voice steady. It's important that fairness is upheld, not just for myself, but for everyone in this room. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. For a moment, no one moved, and the judge appeared to wrestle with the implications of John's words. Finally, the judge's voice broke the silence again, but this time, it was softer, almost resigned. Your fine stands, Judge Fitzgerald declared, but his earlier confidence seemed to have faltered. John didn't respond immediately. He turned, calmly walking back to his seat, but his mind was already working. He knew this wasn't just about a late arrival or a property tax adjustment anymore. It was about systemic bias. It was about making sure that those who had been ignored or mistreated in this very room for years would finally have someone to stand up for them. As he left the courtroom that day, John felt the eyes of the room on him, some filled with respect, others filled with fear. He had made his point. The battle was just beginning, and he wasn't about to back down. The next day, as John sat at his desk in his office, the weight of what had happened in the courtroom still lingered in his mind. He had always prided himself on his ability to stand firm in the face of adversity, but the events of the previous day felt different. The injustice he had experienced was not just personal, it was something systemic, something deeply ingrained in the very fabric of the legal system he had dedicated his life to. He couldn't shake the feeling that the events he had witnessed were a part of a much larger problem, one that went beyond his case, beyond the courthouse in Augusta. John had been a federal prosecutor for years, and over time, he had become accustomed to facing difficult cases and dealing with the flaws within the system. But what had happened in Judge Fitzgerald's courtroom was different. He had witnessed a pattern, a subtle yet clear bias that was being woven into the very fabric of how the court operated. It was a bias that wasn't just about race, it was about who held power and who didn't. It was about who got a break and who was punished unfairly. John had been raised to believe in the fundamental principle of fairness in the law. In the United States, he had been taught, the law was supposed to apply equally to everyone, no matter their race, background, or financial status. But as he replayed the events in his mind, he couldn't help but realize that the rules didn't seem to apply equally to everyone in Judge Fitzgerald's courtroom. It wasn't just that he had been fined for arriving late, it was the way others had been treated differently, as if their lives and their time were less important. It wasn't just a feeling, it was a fact, and John knew it. He had seen the disparities in how black and white defendants were treated in courtrooms across the country. He had read the reports, heard the stories, and seen the data. But now, he had seen it with his own eyes, in real time, in a place where the law was supposed to be blind to such biases. That was when he made the decision, he couldn't let this slide. John's instincts told him this wasn't just about one judge or one courthouse. It was about a larger issue that needed to be addressed, and he was in a unique position to do something about it. He knew he couldn't fight this battle alone, but he also knew that if he didn't take a stand now, nothing would change. He picked up his phone and sent a quick message to his assistant, asking her to gather all the relevant documentation from the courthouse. He had a feeling this wasn't going to be a quick fix. Over the next few days, John dove headfirst into the investigation. He combed through records and interviewed people who had been in Judge Fitzgerald's courtroom. The more he uncovered, the more he realized that the issues he had witnessed were not isolated incidents. They were part of a larger, more troubling pattern of systemic bias. The fines for black defendants were higher, the sentences more severe, and the leniency afforded to white defendants was often non-existent for people of color. John didn't hesitate. He reached out to his colleagues, to legal experts, and to the Judicial Review Commission. He filed an official complaint against Judge Fitzgerald, detailing the evidence he had gathered. This was not just about his case anymore. This was about justice, and about making sure that everyone, regardless of their race or background, was treated equally in the eyes of the law. As John prepared for the next steps, he knew this would be a long and difficult fight. But he also knew that it was a fight worth having. The system was broken, but with enough determination, it could be fixed. And he was ready to lead that change. As the investigation into Judge Fitzgerald's conduct gained momentum, John found himself at the center of a growing storm. The media had picked up on his complaints, and soon, his name was everywhere. News outlets reported on the allegations of bias in the Augusta courthouse, and soon, John was being contacted by journalists from all over the country. Despite the whirlwind of attention, John remained focused. He knew this was bigger than just one case, it was about confronting systemic injustice that had been allowed to persist for far too long. Behind the scenes, the wheels of justice were starting to turn. The Judicial Review Commission, after reviewing the evidence John had presented, began a formal investigation into Judge Fitzgerald's practices. John spent hours compiling records, talking to colleagues, and seeking out testimonies from people who had witnessed similar incidents in the courthouse. The more he gathered, the clearer it became that what he had observed in that courtroom was not an isolated event. There was a pattern, a disturbing trend of unequal treatment that extended beyond just his own experience. John was no stranger to difficult battles. As a federal prosecutor, he had spent his career fighting for justice, and he was determined to see this through. But what he hadn't anticipated was the pushback. As the investigation picked up speed, Judge Fitzgerald's supporters began to rally. They painted John as an opportunist, someone who was simply disgruntled about a minor inconvenience. Some even questioned his motives, implying that he was using his position for personal gain. But John knew better. This wasn't about him, it was about the countless individuals who had been unfairly treated by the legal system for years. It was about standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere around the courthouse grew tense. People began to talk. A former bailiff named James Wilson, who had worked under Judge Fitzgerald for years, stepped forward. James had witnessed the judge's biased behavior firsthand but had always been too afraid to speak out. Now, with the investigation underway, he found the courage to tell his story. He shared his observations with the commission, describing how Judge Fitzgerald had treated black defendants with disdain while offering more leniency to white individuals. His testimony added weight to the growing pile of evidence. John also heard from more people who had appeared in Fitzgerald's courtroom, many of whom were too afraid to speak out publicly. Some of them shared their own experiences of being treated unfairly. One woman, a black mother, recounted how she had been fined $500 for a minor zoning issue, despite presenting clear evidence that the city was at fault. Another young man spoke of how the judge had humiliated him in front of the entire courtroom, questioning his work ethic, only to dismiss a similar case involving a white defendant just minutes later. The more stories John heard, the more determined he became. He wasn't fighting just for his own dignity anymore. He was fighting for justice for all the people who had been silenced and dismissed by a system that was supposed to protect them. As the investigation continued, John began to see the first signs of change. The local media, which had once only focused on the drama of the courtroom, began to shift its coverage. Stories of systemic bias and unequal treatment became the focus, and soon, the public's opinion began to change. People who had once been skeptical of John's claims now rallied behind him, demanding accountability and reform. Even within the courthouse, whispers of change began to circulate. Staff members who had long been complicit in the unequal practices began to question their own roles in perpetuating the system. John knew that this was just the beginning. The battle was far from over, but the first steps toward change had been taken. John's resolve remained unshaken. He continued to work tirelessly, organizing meetings with community leaders, legal experts, and civil rights advocates. He knew that for real change to happen, it couldn't just be about removing one biased judge, it had to be about reforming the entire system. As he worked, he also began to reflect on the personal toll this had taken on him. The stress of the media attention, the resistance from powerful figures, and the constant pressure of the investigation weighed heavily on him. But through it all, he remained focused on the bigger picture, justice for all. In the end, John Harris wasn't just fighting for justice in his own case, he was fighting to ensure that no one else would have to face the same kind of bias and discrimination he had witnessed that morning. The road ahead was long, but with each new piece of evidence and every new ally, he knew they were closer to creating a fairer system for all. As the investigation continued and public pressure mounted, John found himself becoming a central figure in a much larger conversation about racial bias in the judicial system. The media attention had become overwhelming, but John remained steadfast in his mission. He knew that the path ahead wouldn't be easy, and the fight for justice was far from over. But with every passing day, more and more people were stepping forward to share their stories. Their voices, once silenced by fear and intimidation, were now being heard. The Judicial Review Commission had intensified its investigation, and the evidence they uncovered was damning. In addition to the testimonies from James Wilson and others who had witnessed Judge Fitzgerald's biased behavior, the commission began to uncover a disturbing pattern of unequal treatment. The fines imposed on black defendants were consistently higher than those imposed on white defendants for similar offenses. Black individuals were more likely to be interrupted during their hearings, given less opportunity to speak, and often received harsher penalties than their white counterparts. For John, the mounting evidence was both validating and troubling. It confirmed what he had suspected all along, that the injustice he had witnessed in the courthouse was part of a much broader issue that needed to be addressed. He couldn't help but think of the countless individuals who had been affected by this bias over the years, their lives altered by decisions made based on race rather than the merits of their cases. The thought weighed heavily on him, but it also fueled his resolve to see this fight through to the end. While John's work was ongoing, there was another important development: the local community was beginning to take notice. At first, many had been skeptical about John's claims, dismissing them as the concerns of one individual. But as the investigation gained traction and the stories of inequality continued to pour in, the community's perspective began to shift. Activists, local leaders, and civil rights groups rallied behind John, demanding accountability from the court. Public outcry grew, with protesters gathering outside the courthouse, calling for an end to the systemic bias they had long suspected but never had the evidence to prove. As the pressure on Judge Fitzgerald mounted, the judge's supporters began to waver. For the first time, those who had once defended his actions found themselves questioning the legitimacy of their arguments. Judge Fitzgerald, whose authority had been unquestioned for so long, was now facing a reckoning. Despite his initial defiance, the mounting evidence and public outcry were forcing him to confront the reality of his actions. John knew that the judge's resignation was inevitable, but it wasn't just about his departure, it was about ensuring that the systemic issues he had uncovered were addressed once and for all. The day came when Judge Fitzgerald announced his resignation. The statement, delivered with minimal fanfare, was met with mixed reactions. Some viewed it as an admission of guilt, while others saw it as a necessary step toward healing. For John, it was a moment of vindication, but not one of celebration. It marked the beginning of a new chapter, one in which the focus would shift from removing one biased judge to ensuring that the entire system underwent meaningful reform. John knew that the work didn't end with Fitzgerald's resignation. This was just the first step toward fixing a broken system. With the support of the community, legal experts, and civil rights advocates, John began working on comprehensive reforms. He pushed for mandatory bias training for all judges and court staff, advocating for regular audits of case outcomes to ensure that disparities in sentencing were identified and addressed. It was clear to him that this was not a problem that could be solved overnight, but he was determined to see it through. In the months that followed, John's efforts began to pay off. The courthouse in Augusta underwent significant changes. A new, more progressive judge was appointed to replace Fitzgerald, and reforms to court procedures were put in place. Judges and staff were required to undergo training on recognizing and addressing bias in their decision-making. John's fight had sparked a broader movement, one that was inspiring similar efforts in courtrooms across the state and even the nation. His dedication had not only brought about change in Augusta but had ignited a conversation about justice and equality that was long overdue. As John reflected on everything that had transpired, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. The road had been long and fraught with challenges, but the changes that had been set in motion were real. He had not only stood up for himself but had fought for the rights of those who had been wronged by a system that had failed them. It wasn't just about winning a case. It was about ensuring that everyone, regardless of their background or race, would have the same opportunity for fair treatment in the eyes of the law. For John, that was as John continued to work on the reforms following Judge Fitzgerald's resignation, he was reminded that change, while necessary, was never simple. The success in Augusta had been a victory, but it was just the beginning of a much larger movement. The court system in Georgia, and across the nation, had long been riddled with disparities that many had turned a blind eye to. John knew this fight was not a singular event, it was a battle that would require continuous effort, collaboration, and perseverance. The outpouring of support for John had been overwhelming. People from all walks of life reached out to express their gratitude for what he had done. Letters poured in, some sharing personal stories of discrimination and others offering words of encouragement. Among the letters was one from an elderly black woman, who had lived in Augusta for over 50 years. She shared how her own experiences with the justice system had left her feeling marginalized and unheard. She thanked John for his courage in standing up and making sure her voice, and the voices of others like her, were finally being heard. But not everyone was supportive. There were still those who defended the status quo, who believed that the court system had been working just fine and that John's efforts were nothing more than a disruption. A group of attorneys, many of whom had worked in Judge Fitzgerald's court, began to push back. They argued that John was overreacting, that the problems he highlighted were isolated incidents rather than systemic issues. Some even claimed that the media had blown everything out of proportion, painting Fitzgerald's actions as worse than they were. John was well aware of the resistance, but he was undeterred. He had known from the start that real change would require challenging deeply ingrained attitudes and structures. The media's portrayal of him as a whistleblower and a reformer had made him a target for some, but it had also brought attention to the issues he had been fighting for. The national conversations about racial bias in the courtroom were beginning to shift, and John felt a deep sense of responsibility to keep pushing for the reforms that were so desperately needed. As part of the broader movement for change, John had been invited to speak at legal conferences and community forums. These speaking engagements were opportunities not only to share his personal experience but also to educate others about the pervasive issues of racial bias in the legal system. He shared his story with audiences across the country, and each time he spoke, he received messages from lawyers, law students, and community leaders who were inspired to take action in their own areas. Many of them, especially young black lawyers, expressed that John's courage had reignited their own passion for justice and equality. The most rewarding part of John's journey, however, came when he saw the tangible impact of his efforts. In Augusta, the reforms were starting to take root. The new judge, a progressive leader who had been appointed to replace Fitzgerald, was committed to upholding the principles of fairness and impartiality. The mandatory bias training for all court staff was in full swing, and John took part in some of the sessions, offering his perspective as someone who had witnessed the damage of unchecked prejudice firsthand. The courthouse, once a place where inequality was hidden behind the gavel, was transforming into a space where accountability and transparency were becoming the new norms. Yet, as the reforms began to take shape, John knew that systemic change was a long-term project. He wasn't finished. His work in Augusta had made an impact, but he understood that for the change to be truly lasting, it would require widespread commitment across the entire state and the nation. He continued to push for audits of court decisions and advocated for the creation of independent oversight committees to monitor judicial conduct. These committees would serve as a check on the power of judges, ensuring that no one person or group could wield authority without being held accountable. John had already seen how his actions had rippled outward, sparking a nationwide dialogue about bias and fairness in the courts. He realized that the fight for justice was an ongoing one, and that it was his responsibility to continue leading that charge. Every victory, every small step toward a more equitable system, was part of a much larger journey. John had started this fight to ensure that people like the elderly black woman who had written to him would no longer feel voiceless and invisible. He couldn't stop now, not when the road ahead was so full of potential for lasting change. As he stood before another audience, preparing to speak once more about the importance of reform, John felt a renewed sense of purpose. The work ahead was difficult, but he was no longer fighting alone. His message had found an audience, and he would continue to fight for a fairer, more just legal system, one where every person, regardless of race, background, or status, could stand before the law and know they would be treated equally. Months passed since the momentous changes in the Augusta courthouse, and John Harris found himself once again at the crossroads of progress and resistance. The reforms he had championed were taking hold, but he knew that true change was never as simple as signing new policies or passing a resolution. What mattered most was the culture shift within the system, the commitment of individuals to uphold the principles of fairness, equality, and justice, not just when the spotlight was on them, but every single day. John had been invited to speak at various law schools, community centers, and legal forums across the country. His message had resonated with many, particularly younger generations of lawyers who were eager to make their mark on a system they recognized needed change. John had become a symbol of perseverance and integrity, someone who stood firm in the face of adversity to ensure that no one was left behind. He was proud of the impact his efforts had already had, but he knew there was still much work to be done. At one such event, a young law student approached him with a notebook filled with ideas for reform. "Mr. Harris," she said earnestly, "what do you think is the most important thing we can do to make the system fairer?" John smiled at the earnestness in her eyes and paused for a moment to think. "Listen," he said simply. "Listen to each other. Listen to the people who come through our courts and those who have been too afraid to speak up. Listening is where real change begins." The words felt right to him, as he reflected on how his own actions had been sparked by the voices that had gone unheard for so long. It was only by listening that he had discovered the deep cracks in the system, the biases that ran unchecked and unnoticed. Listening, truly hearing the stories of those who had been affected by the system, was the first step toward dismantling those biases. The ripple effect of his message continued to grow. Across the state of Georgia, and even in other parts of the country, courts began to implement the reforms John had advocated for. Audit systems were established to regularly review sentencing disparities, especially those that could be linked to racial bias. Judges, court staff, and legal professionals attended mandatory training sessions on recognizing and confronting implicit bias. The process was slow, and there were those who resisted, but the tide was turning. The country, it seemed, was waking up to the undeniable fact that the system needed to change, and that change could no longer wait. Back in Augusta, John continued to work tirelessly. He had helped bring about a shift in the local court system, but he was not satisfied with just one courthouse. He was determined to ensure that other cities, other states, followed the example set by Augusta. His next steps included pushing for national oversight of the judicial system, one that would hold courts accountable not only for their actions but for their decisions. He envisioned a world where no one would fear the courtrooms, where every individual, regardless of their race, class, or background, could stand before the law and trust that they would be treated fairly. One afternoon, as John reviewed case files in his office, his assistant brought him a letter. It was from the retired attorney in Alabama, the one who had written to him months ago. The letter thanked him again, but this time, it added a new note. "Because of your courage," the letter read, "I've begun to speak out too. I've started looking into the courts where I practiced for years, and I'm finally ready to confront the issues I once ignored." John felt a lump form in his throat as he read the letter. He wasn't just fighting for the people in Augusta anymore. His actions had inspired people across the country to look at their own legal systems and ask the hard questions. The impact of his work had spread far beyond what he could have imagined. As he sat back in his chair, John felt a sense of peace settle over him. The journey was far from over, but he had made a difference, a real difference. He had started a conversation that could not be silenced, and more importantly, he had given others the courage to join in. The fight for justice wasn't something one person could win alone. It was a collective effort, and John Harris knew that with every new voice that joined the cause, they were one step closer to the fair and equal system they all deserved. In the end, that was the true victory. The change wasn't just in the law, it was in the people who had been awakened by the need for justice. And for John, that was enough to keep fighting for as long as it took. The story of John Harris teaches us an important lesson about standing up for what is right, even when it's difficult. In life, we often face systems and situations that feel unfair, whether in the workplace, in communities, or even within our own families. But like John, we have the power to make a difference by speaking out and taking action, especially when we see injustice. The key takeaway here is that change starts with each of us. It's about listening to others, understanding their struggles, and standing up against any form of bias or unfair treatment. John's persistence shows that while we may face resistance, true progress comes from pushing forward with integrity and compassion. His story reminds us that no matter our age or position, we can all contribute to a better world. As we age, we accumulate wisdom and experience, and it's up to us to use that knowledge to shape a fairer society for future generations. The courage to confront wrongs and work for change doesn't diminish with age. Instead, it can become a guiding force for others to follow. If you were moved by John's fight for justice and the courage it took to challenge the system, make sure to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think one person can truly change the system? We'd love to hear your perspective. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories of resilience and change. By subscribing, you help us bring more powerful, real-life stories to light. Join us on this journey and stay tuned for more inspiring content.